Okay guys, this is a little bit more of a random video, but I got kind of interested in like the history of bookkeeping in terms of how it switched from like paper ledgers to the digital age. And I'm also going to bring you all the way back, starting in ancient civilizations and then how bookkeeping kind of evolved over time. And of course, I will try to keep it as concise and interesting as possible. So starting in 300 BCE with the Sumerians, they actually had clay tablets and they would use a stylus and stamp it onto clay. This is called a cuneiform. I think that's how you say it. You probably learned about it in history and then maybe forgot about it. But if you think about it, back then they had goods, they had livestock, they had agricultural products, things that they needed to keep track of. So that's how they did that. And then the ancient Egyptians were using hieroglyphics, we've heard of this, and they would write them on papyrus, so like the beginning of paper, and they would track things like when is the Nile flooding and like what are the financial implications of floods. They also collected taxes, so they needed a system to keep track of that, and then any trading that was done also, they tracked with hieroglyphics. Moving on to the Roman Empire, these guys had a little bit more sophisticated way of tracking. They would track their income and expenses specifically for the government, and they did that on either wax tablets or later parchment paper. Moving on to the Middle Ages, monks were the people that were the most literate. So we actually have some financial records that have survived like over time. So in the monasteries, they would track the land, any donations, and then they would track agricultural finances as well. And during the same time in the Middle Ages, trade was starting to grow. And so there was merchants, and the merchants had to keep track of finances, right? And this is one of the first instances when we see them keeping track of debts. So maybe you would like run up a tab at your local like merchant office for your food or your flour or whatever you were buying. So they would track debits, credits, and inventory as well. Moving on to the Renaissance, we have someone born, a mathematician in Italy, who was called the father of accounting. And this is Luca Pacioli, and he was born in 1494. He wrote a book that detailed his method of accounting, and it was what we call double entry bookkeeping. And this is what is actually used in QuickBooks now. We don't always see it as bookkeepers, but it is what's kind of going on behind the scenes with debits and credits. I have a video about debits and credits if you want more information on that. So because of Luca Pacioli's book, this double entry accounting system was widely used all throughout Europe. All right, then moving across the ocean to colonial America, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is they had something called a waste book. So they would record all the daily transactions and like receipts in there, and then that was just meant to be a temporary thing, and then they would transfer all that info into the daily ledger. So you can see some of this accounting and bookkeeping vocabulary is starting to come across. Some of the terms that we use today, like ledger or account or journal entry, like those things like kind of feel a little outdated, but it's kind of interesting to know their history. You know, there used to be like an actual physical journal, and you would make a journal entry in your journal. Okay, and then finally moving into the 20th century. So the first half of the 20th century, bookkeepers still had a literal book that they were keeping, and they would write everything down in there. So technology is advancing every decade, right? So maybe we have the receipts that will now print out. We have calculators that would be a big help if you didn't have a calculator, and then one was invented. To us, of course, it still seems really manual, but I'm sure they're appreciating all of the advances that are happening over time. And I have a video on my channel you can search for. It's kind of like a tangent of this, but it's about how to explain to a client that you should be a contractor instead of an employee of their business, because typically employees are paid less, and contractors, you can set your own hours and set your own rates. But my point is that sometimes business owners have in their mind an outdated concept of what a bookkeeper does. So really understanding some of these advancements that have happened in the last like 30, 20 years can help you speak to what a bookkeeper looks like today. And you can also search my channel for the video on advisory services, because that's kind of what we're going to now. My website is finepoints.biz if you want even more bookkeeper support. I'm Morgan if you've never met me. I'd love it if you subscribe to my channel. If you've made it this far and you're interested in the history of bookkeeping, you probably like a lot of the other practical videos I have as well. So now let's get on to what's happened since the 1980s. So as late as the 1970s, bookkeeping could still be really tedious. It was very error prone because, you know, you're a human trying to write all these things in this book and add everything up. So the 80s and 90s is kind of like the dawn of the computerized accounting systems. So the earliest accounting software, there was one called Peachtree and then one called Quicken that actually came out the year I was born, 1983. So these are really the precursors to what we see now as accounting software. So then of course everything's moving to digital. It's easier to retrieve information, to find information, to calculate things. And then then in 1992, QuickBooks came out. So of course this was QuickBooks Desktop, so probably a CD that you would buy, install on your computer, and then you could do your bookkeeping that way. There was also a program called Microsoft Money that I think did a similar thing. Every year these programs are getting more and more sophisticated. So now in these programs you can do budgeting, you can do some payroll, you can create and pull reports, and then my research said this made paper bookkeeping almost obsolete. I will say, a lot of business owners, they take time to get used to new technology. So even as late as like 2010, 2015, I still have seen some businesses that have like a paper aspect of their businesses. And then in the 2000s, cloud technology really becomes like the standard, right? So people want to be able to access their books from anywhere, and everyone's getting more comfortable with online banking. There is security measures in place because, you know, there's a trust that has to be there. So QuickBooks Online actually launched in 2001. So that was a lot earlier than I thought in my brain, because I became a bookkeeper in 2012, and I don't think it was even 50% of people were using at that point. That's just anecdotal. It wasn't until like 2016 that I exclusively switched to QuickBooks Online, and I think I was kind of on a typical trajectory. I wasn't like behind the times or anything. So that is like a full 15 years after QuickBooks Online came out. And then speaking of like the 2010s, things are, again, they're just advancing and getting more sophisticated. So they came out with bank feeds. I love bank feeds. And they also started connecting third-party apps. So just different, like I connect my QuickBooks to Gusto Payroll, and there's a bunch of things you can connect it to. So just advances in technology that makes your life easier. And that of course brings us to where we are today, the 2020s. And of course we've seen a ton of AI advancements in the last few years. And I do already have a video out if you have the question like, is AI gonna take over bookkeeping? I have like a whole 10-12 minute video that addresses that. I have seen the bookkeeping field changing and changing in the last like 10-ish years I've been a bookkeeper, and you do have to continually kind of like figure out what the next thing is, but I do not see the profession totally going away. I think that there's still gonna be business owners out there for the next 20 years that want a human to help them. They don't want to be solely responsible for their books and for paying bills and for learning the technology and for checking the AI stuff. So check out that video if that interests you. So starting out with those clay tablets all the way to AI QuickBooks Online, hopefully that was a little bit interesting to you and kind of gives you overall appreciation for where we've come and, you know, just the history of our profession. I feel like that's always helpful.